This plenary kicks off with a rapid-fire review of the latest trends in international student recruitment and mobility, with a spotlight on the most important implications for education providers and businesses in Cyprus. These developments set the tone for how we might respond to fluctuating market conditions and innovate in the face of disruption. As competition intensifies around the world and the pace of technological change quickens, it becomes even more challenging for institutions to attract and engage students. Moreover, the pandemic has drastically altered the educational experience. Jacqueline will share compelling examples from both within and beyond the education industry of powerful marketing methods and strategies that leaders can use to remain competitive and differentiate their brand in the months and years ahead. Please welcome Mrs. Jacqueline Kassteen.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Hopefully everyone can see me and hear me okay. Shall I begin? Just waiting for a signal to make sure we're a go for launch. Okay, great. I think we're ready to go. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time out of your calendars to be with us for what I hope will be an interesting session for you. Now, first things first, a little spoiler alert. Although my company is called Jackfruit Marketing, I don't sell jackfruit. But when you've got a fruit with the same name as you, it just makes life a little bit more fun. So there's me in China about 10 years ago when I first discovered jackfruit while I was traveling. And since then, it became a bit of a nickname for me. And then a natural choice when I came up with a company name. So if you want to know more about jackfruits, there is some fun information on my website, but there's also some more serious information as well about what we do and how we help institutions and companies all around the world. So we work on either a long-term consultancy basis, we do short-term projects such as our marketing audits, which are very popular. I offer training, I'm a guest lecturer, and I usually am flying around the world for conferences like this one, and I miss traveling just as much as I'm sure all of you do. So in the meantime, with Jackfruit, we'll work on branding, on content marketing, on campaigns, on slogans, messaging, and essentially we help our clients to transition from where you're at now to a stage of growth, to build value and to generate revenue. And in that process, I'm constantly looking at market changes and developments and finding ways of making disruption work for you. And I'm going to give you some examples of that today. So we'll kick off with a quick overview of the international education market as it stands today. We'll look at some challenges, there are many, and some coping strategies. This year has obviously been disruptive, but there are ways around it. We're going to also look at understanding today's consumers and students. What do they want? What do they need? And we'll look at how to stand out in a competitive market. So let's start with a brief overview of the market. A lot of people don't really think about international education as an industry, but it's bigger than you might realize, and it's an industry which is becoming increasingly important for the island of Cyprus. So pre-COVID, there were about 5 million international higher ed students around the world, plus another 2 million language students going overseas for more short-term courses. Those last anywhere from a couple weeks up to a year. And reports have estimated that as of 2016, international students contributed a whopping $300 billion to the global economy. So it is much bigger than you might have realized. But today, educators are operating in increasingly competitive times, not to mention with tighter budgets and greater expectations from senior management, from shareholders, as well as from today's demanding students and parents. Now, obviously, COVID has brought our industry pretty much to a standstill, but pre-COVID, it was predicted that about 7 million students would have been on the move this year and another 8 million in a few years to come. Now, That's the relative size of the international higher education market as it stands. But where are all these students coming from? Well, not all of them, but many of them will start at an English medium primary or secondary school. Now that's a big market in itself, actually, with 5.8 million students in over 11,000 English medium schools. And these schools act like feeders for an international education abroad. The children and the parents are globally minded, they can afford a private education, and they're often trilingual. Of course, they're bilingual because it's an English medium school. Most of them are trilingual as well. So they're primed and ready to study overseas at higher education. Now, in the past, it was kind of understood that a lot of these international schools were mainly meant for expats, but more and more in recent years, we've seen domestic families enrolling their children in these schools. And in Cyprus, I believe right now you've got about 15 international schools, and some of them are also teaching in Arabic, French, and Russian. So let's think about this and take a step back. Why would somebody want to study away from home? Well, the answers vary greatly depending on what type of student you are and where you're from. So, for example, in some countries, there's simply a limited number of available seats at prestigious universities at home. And that's particularly the case, we see that in India, Nigeria, and in Vietnam. Now, in other countries, there's a culture of going abroad or an expectation, such as in Saudi Arabia. But still in other countries, the drivers are different. For example, in Indonesia, there's pressure to go abroad, either to support the family or to honor them. Now, historically, we've seen that families in emerging and developing markets, as they move into the into upper and middle class markets, sorry about that. So we've seen that as families will move up in the ranks of economies, when they move into middle and upper class society, let's say, then because of course those families can afford a better education, they'll send their children abroad to get that better education, wherever it might be. But meanwhile, in wealthier nations, we see that a lot of students will go abroad simply because it's fun, right? You get to enjoy and experience new cultures, maybe learn some languages, broaden your social circles, broaden your minds. But in recent years, the social aspect is not as strong as a driver. Now, more and more students want to study abroad because that experience can lead to employment abroad, perhaps, or to better prospects when they return home, better salaries, better promotions, better opportunities. So these drivers and how they vary from one country to the next are especially important to keep in mind when it comes to adjusting the marketing messages that you as an educator might use when appealing to prospective students in foreign countries. But also from a strategy perspective, these drivers are incredibly important to look at to see how can we forecast some long-term predictions around how demand for an education abroad might change. So here's an example of that. Now, in the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen the rise of distance learning and transnational education. For example, branch campuses are opening up. Now, if you don't work in education, you can think of a branch campus kind of like a franchise. For example, the University of Central Lancashire in England has a branch campus in Larnaca. And there's actually about 250 or 300 branch campuses all around the world now. So transnational education, or T&E as we call it, this also includes joint degrees and dual degrees. Let's say a student might study at home for 2 years and then do another 2 years overseas. So this gives students more options at home, and hence it can change the need to fully study overseas. Now, as mentioned more than anything, we see that employment is one of the biggest drivers for international education, along with the ability to afford it. But now, even if the quality of education at home is not so great, even if the seats are limited at home, you can still get a degree overseas thanks to technology. And of course, because of COVID, we see that access to technology has really taken much more of a center stage position this year, since online learning is almost one of the only options that some students have. So this access to technology and these transnational education options are opening up new opportunities, new ways to obtain an education. Is this dampening the appeal of study abroad? No, because quite frankly, it's a very different experience. So what it is doing is it's giving students more options. Technology doesn't replace education, it enhances it. Now, the impact of COVID on the international education industry is a different beast altogether, but I think we'll get into that a little bit more in the Q&A. There are some positive and some negative impacts of COVID for our industry. But let's put Cyprus back in focus and take a look at how international education is impacting your country. Now, as the far right column will show, you've had a steady, manageable growth of foreign students coming in with a few big gains in recent years. And essentially, you've got about a 50-50 ratio of Cypriots and foreigners here. But who are those foreigners? Let's take a closer look. So these are your top sending nations according to your 2018 government report. It shows that 92.5% of your European students come from Greece. And incidentally, UNESCO reports that almost the same number of Cypriots go to Greece as Greeks come to Cyprus. So it's kind of an even swap there. But beyond the Greece and the EU, if you look in the other column, you'll notice that 48.5% of your non-EU enrollments come from India. And just under 10% come from Bangladesh and from Pakistan. And you've got a good showing from across the African continent with about 14% of your non-EU enrollments. Now, what do all these numbers mean? Well, overall, we see that Cyprus has an over-reliance on Greece. That's about 61% of your international students, and an over-reliance on India at 16% of the total international student body. You've got a good mix of non-EU countries as a base to grow from, and there's some work to do in terms of attracting more European students. Now, why do all of these numbers matter? Why should Cyprus try to change this? Well, first, there's the cultural argument. To be a hub for education indicates a robust, strong showing of students from all around the world. Good mix, good numbers. The second is the strategy element. It is very risky to rely on one or two sending markets, and most countries do fall into this trap. Most of them will rely on China and India, for example. But the third factor as to why this is important is that non-EUs pay higher fees than your domestic or your EU students. So there is a financial factor there as well. I just mentioned China, and for example, the Chinese market alone is worth at least 35.7 million euros each year to the country of Ireland. So lots of arguments for changing some of these numbers just a bit as you move forward. Now, where can you find more international students? Well, let's look at the younger population. Who's up, who's down? Now, some markets are seeing a continuous long-term decrease of youth populations, such as in China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, as well as those closer to home like Russia or Germany or Italy. But recruitment is not about just finding bodies to come to Cyprus. Think about how your country or your institution can fulfill a need for these origin countries based on what might be happening there locally. This isn't just about Cyprus. Put yourself in their shoes. So think about how your institution can make their home country better and stronger. Think about how these students can contribute to their economy and to their society when they return home. Now, Cyprus is already getting a good showing of students from a lot of these countries here in the top 50, in the top forecast for the year 2050. But there are a few that you can still look to for some long-term growth potential, such as Mexico or Ethiopia or Congo. But remember, don't be over-reliant on one or two markets. There are several emerging and frontier markets out there with booming youth populations and economies, which post-COVID are predicted to recover faster than those in the West. So who is Cyprus competing with? Which other countries out there want to be an education hub? Well, lots of them. This is a very competitive space, and you can really feel this battle going on amongst the heavy-hitting destination markets. And as institutions all around the world are ramping up their marketing and their recruitment activities, traditional destinations are losing market share. So if you look at your top classic destination markets like the US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, collectively, all of these major countries lost 5% market share in under 10 years between 2001 and 2010. So we see a lot of competition. We also see these grandiose enrollment targets coming out from countries. Now notice that those 6 countries in bold there have already hit their targets ahead of schedule. And also notice that 3 of those countries up there are native English-speaking destinations. So having an English degree is the norm now, it's the expectation. Now, what makes all of these countries so attractive? Well, many of them are easing the pathways for foreign students. They're offering various immigration options, as well as generous part-time and post-study work rights. Now, next, I want to show you 4 countries as a little bit of a case study comparison. Let's look at 2 big winners. Now notice that the graphs up there will show you the higher education sector, whereas the text below shows you all sectors, language, vocational, and higher education. Now, Canada saw almost 120% increase in international student enrollments between the years of 2010 and 2017. So this is phenomenal growth for 2 strong, heavy-hitting destination countries. But this ebb and flow of students all around the world can be heavily influenced by politics, by economic swings, and by currency fluctuations. And sometimes it can change at the drop of a hat. So, little story for you comes from Canada. About a year or 2 ago, the Saudi government pulled all of their students out of Canadian higher education pretty much overnight. Now, luckily for Canada, Saudis were still a small percentage of their international student enrollment body. So the institutions could pretty much roll with the punches. This happens too late in the school year for them to be able to replace those seats and fill those seats with other students who would have wanted them. So that was quite disappointing. It was most disappointing, of course, for the students themselves, who had a very disruptive experience and were forced to return back home to Saudi Arabia. Now, these situations are unusual. We don't expect them to happen, but as we know, anything can happen, particularly this year. Now, if this had happened in America, for example, this could have been an absolute disaster. Saudis occupy a large percentage of the international student body across America. So this would have been very, very disappointing and very, very much a struggle for American institutions. Now, luckily, that didn't happen. So, sorry, I'm getting everything was okay. It's so different being in our homes, isn't it? Right, so luckily this didn't happen in America. And we don't expect these things to happen, but we do need to be prepared. And if you're over-reliant on 1 or 2 markets, things like this can go wrong. Now, Australia, on the other hand, they know these games all too well. There are some political tensions that rise up now and then between Australia and China, for example. And the Australian market is, like many, heavily dependent on the Chinese market for their international student enrollments. So as they've seen their climb up with international students coming to Australia, they've had a bit of a cautious optimism, let's say. And they've also seen a dip in their enrollments before. Between the years of 2010 and 2013, they did have some struggles with international student enrollments, and you can see that dip there. So they're a little bit more cautious. The sector in Australia is very collaborative, very transparent with data reporting as well, and there is a healthy attitude there towards managing change. So let's look at, let's say, a more realistic comparison of smaller countries that we can compare Cyprus to. New Zealand and Ireland. Now, they've been focusing on enhancing their pathways from English language training into higher education, as well as focusing on the quality of education and the experience that they're offering, and on partnerships. So Ireland, for example, got €500,000 in government funding for higher ed partnerships. And just 2 weeks ago, a nice success story, University College Dublin announced the opening of 2 international colleges in China earlier this year. And despite the difficulties of COVID, both colleges opened in September with close to 750 enrollments between them. And they've already got a college there already, which has about 1,300 students. So they've been able to manage the crisis quite well thanks to those partnerships overseas. So there are some success stories in the midst of the pandemic. Now, down in New Zealand, different story. They've deliberately said, you know what, we don't have a numbers target. We have a satisfaction target. We don't just want students, we want happy students. So they're focusing on different things. They're looking very carefully at that educational experience that's being offered. They're also making sure that students spread out across the country, since too many of them are concentrated in the Auckland region. They also want a good diversity of source markets. They're looking at removing low quality providers from the market, and they're looking to eliminate non-genuine students that try to enter the country through the student visa process. So different targets. Now, keep in mind that all of this growth does not come easy. So consider where you can differentiate and how Cyprus will manage this growth going forward. Now, other countries who have grown have suffered some growing pains. For example, in Ireland or in the Netherlands, there can be somewhat of a housing crisis. Too many students, not enough supply. In the Netherlands, we saw a bit of a backlash against the overuse of English at universities and the lack of Dutch. In Japan, there's been some complaints as to teacher quality, not enough lecturers being fluent in English. In Germany, on the other hand, we see some problems with retention and high dropout rates. So there are many lessons that Cyprus can learn from other countries who are also trying to recruit more international students and perhaps growing a bit too fast or finding some struggles along the way. Growth is never easy, but this is also a reason for a deliberate strategy towards growth. So, 4 countries, what do they have in common? Well, 4 countries, 4 things in common. We've got work rights for foreign students and for graduates. We've got a welcoming attitude towards foreigners. You also see a streamlined visa and application process for international students in those 4 countries. And you see a stagnant or declining domestic youth population. So they need to fill those seats with international students. COVID has forced all of us to change whether we wanted to or not, which is actually a good thing because most people don't really like changes too much. It's kind of human nature to resist change. But the international education industry is actually very accustomed to dealing with change and disruption for quite some time now. So COVID, while it is probably one of the worst disruptive factors that we've seen recently, COVID is actually just one of many disruptive changes that we've seen in our industry. And I'll give you a second to just scan through that list quickly there. Okay, so as you can see, the international education industry is going through quite a lot of disruption almost on a daily basis. And all of this disruption, it can be quite intimidating. I've sort of deliberately packed a lot into that slide there to show you how scary and how disruptive our industry can be. But all of this disruption that we're seeing, to me, this also means opportunity, particularly for those institutions that can find new markets, new partnerships, or strengthen the partnerships that they have, and find innovative ways to appeal to Generation Y and Z, and remain on the cutting edge of that change that is so disruptive in the first place. Now, some of these developments can be good. For example, if countries are tightening up quality controls, that might lead to closures or mergers, but that also improves the quality of the education providers in that country. So that's a good change. And MOOCs, massive open online courses. Now, these have been around for quite a while, but traditionally many educators resisted online learning. Some of them have had a real struggle to try to adapt into this online world. Now, of course, this year, it's pretty much been a boom for some institutions. So those who were able to adapt to change earlier could manage disruptions better in the longer term. Now, ultimately, at the end, whether you're facing these changes or any other changes in your particular industry, I often say that there are 3 main ways to cope with change, and that is to change your product or your service, change or enhance your partnerships, and improve your marketing and your branding. So I'll show you a few examples of things like that. Now, Also, let's look at change from the student's perspective as well. Now, even before COVID, all of those disruptions I just showed you were having an impact on international students as well. So they do have the ability to cause mobility swings. Let's say currency fluctuations. That can cause a student to suddenly not be able to afford their first choice institution, so perhaps they have to choose a different country or a different institution. Things can always change. But with all of this disruption happening all around the world, it's important for us to embrace that change and to find new ways to deal with it. So there are many opportunities out there to engage with students along the way. For example, now, thanks to COVID, a lot of students who physically cannot come to an institution, they're using remote learning, and once the borders open up, they'll get to experience that education for themselves firsthand. For students who are still younger and waiting to study abroad, let's say they're looking for a start date of 2022, well, there's plenty of time. And in fact, our industry has a very long sales cycle, as it were, to woo students. So there's lots of opportunities to continue to engage with students all throughout that recruitment and sales cycle. Now, when you're looking at entering a new market, let's say, or overcoming today's challenges and disruptions, I advocate for a rich mix of strategies, but starting with a strong leadership at the top and an advocacy for change, for diversity, for strategic exploration, and for experimentation. This is the time to try new things. Consumers are pretty forgiving today, given all of the change and the anxiety that we're under due to the pandemic. Consumers want you to try new things and to do something different. So now is the time to take those calculated risks, to be brave, to be bold, and to do things that maybe you thought weren't possible before. We have more and more technology at our fingertips today. Now's the time to use it. And as mentioned, diversifying your markets in education, extremely important. This is a chance to explore, to go deeper, to look deeper into certain countries you're already working in. For example, China, huge market. Many educators go into the main cities of Beijing or Shanghai, but there are lots of secondary and tertiary cities there that are ripe with opportunity for educators. So of course, diversifying your lead sources, your partners, your education offering, all quite important. Now, I might also suggest a shift in mindset. People don't like to hear it, but in some ways, education can be a bit of a commodity. Now, yes, quality does vary, but when you're looking at hundreds of high quality institutions and highly ranked programs, maybe it's not your offer that's so unique. Maybe it's actually the educational experience and the brand experience you offer that is unique. So concentrate on your unique selling points and your market differentiators. And promote the education outcomes, such as employment, as I mentioned, highly important, but also think beyond your institution. International students will typically choose a country first and then an institution. So it's a crucial time for the sector here in Cyprus to come together to promote the destination first and that full package that Cyprus offers that other countries might not be able to compete with. Now, ultimately, the most effective student recruitment is about finding the best match between one student and one institution. And there are many opportunities here for universities to create powerful messages that stand out in a cluttered environment, and especially to create an emotional connection with your prospective and your current students, as well as your brand champions, your alumni, and your partners. So let's talk a little bit more about this customer-centric approach. Now, if we want to put our customers first, it's obviously going to be pretty important for us to fully understand them and to know what's important to them. And we do this by building customer personas. So what do I mean by that? Well, a customer persona is pretty much different types of customers that you have and different customers that you want to have. Now, why is any of this important? Well, it turns out that websites, for example, which market specifically to personas are 2 to 5 times more effective than websites which have general copy or content on them. So more specific you are with a customer, the more appealing you'll be to that customer, the more effective your marketing is, and the more you can find customers that are like them. Makes sense, right? So let me show you a few examples. What do I mean by personas? So these are some examples of common personas that you might find in the international education market. But even if you're not in education, you might find some similarities here. So for example, if you're a travel company, you probably have the adventurer clients that want to get out there and explore and push themselves to the limits. Or you might find culture seekers. You might also find some nature lovers, and you might find those who just want to go on holiday and relax. So whatever industry you're in, I'd encourage you to think about building customer personas if you haven't already got them. Now, your goal with personas, first and foremost, is to understand what is this customer's goal? Why are they buying my product or service? What do they want and need? Also, you want to look carefully at their profile, demographics, but psychology as well, to understand them and to find more customers like them. You also want to appeal to them and win them over and close the sale, right? So you want to understand what is their decision-making criteria and what is their satisfaction criteria. Now, remember those mobility drivers that I spoke about earlier? Well, those factor in here as well. So for example, let's say you have the academic students. Maybe his motivational driver is that he's being pushed or kind of forced into this, or it's an expectation from the parents. So he's got to make them proud. He is a very serious, or she is a very serious student. So perhaps some of the messaging that you give to this student is going to be focused on rankings, on the quality of your programs. Maybe you send recommended reading lists or sample exams or course assignments that student is going to have at higher education to get them primed and ready. Now, you might also have an explorer students. They maybe have a little bit less of an attention span. They're more excited. So you want to show a lot of visual content, video content. You want to help them dream and imagine themselves in that destination. Now, they might be completely convinced that this is a great idea for them and you don't have to sell them or persuade them too much, but you might have to persuade the parents who might be paying for the education. So the messages and the materials that you send to the student are going to be different as well. So personas can vary in many different ways. And I encourage you to dig really deep and to look at some of those customer journeys that your personas go on as well to try to get into their mindset. Now, what can you do once you have personas? Lots of things. Here's a few examples. First, of course, you can adjust your website. You can personalize it to your visitors based on their IP address using geolocation, because you don't want to try to be all things to all people. So you can easily customize to a local audience to build trust and to speak to their cultural priorities. So here's a simple example. If you're in Ireland and you come to this website, you're greeted with that warm Irish welcome. If you're in Germany, this website has a very clear and direct message for you. And if you're in Brazil, here they're stressing that this website is the official reseller of these tickets. So they're stressing the legal status there, as opposed to maybe being the most popular or the most liked website. So you can adjust and customize based on IP address. You can also make customized landing pages or entire microsites based on location or personas. So these are just some ways to use personas. But you can also use them, of course, in campaigns and in advertising. So when you know your customers really well, you can create messaging that speaks to them. Clever advertising like this that really pops, makes you smile a little bit, but it speaks to a very, very specific person. And of course, we want to be 50-50, so we've got one for the girls as well. The ladies out there, gotta be equal today. So that's an example of print advertising, but let's see about video. How can you use personas to speak to certain customers using personas in video? Let's see. Okay, I hope the sound is working for you over there. Now, you can see that Schweppes is sophisticated, right? Whereas Smirnoff is very scandalous or naughty or almost dangerous. They have a new advert now for smashed Smirnoff vodka with like smashed grapefruits and things. And that's very dark and very mysterious. But the Schweppes persona would never run around like this. His drink comes to him on a silver platter. He wants to be served. He wants to be seen. He doesn't want to hide. So you can see that these ads speak to two very different personas. Next, we'll look at another example, good old Coca-Cola. Now, this brand has always portrayed itself as a family brand. It's meant to be drunk together. No one drinks a Coke alone. And you don't just drink a Coke, you share a Coke. It's a highly social brand. And even their billboards or their print adverts show people who are practically hugging at the same time as they're drinking a Coca-Cola. It's a little bit extreme in terms of the social aspects. But you don't also just taste a Coke, you taste a feeling. It's an emotion that they're trying to convey. And that is one of community, of family, of gathering. It's a happy moment. It's so wonderful that even Santa loves Coke. But let's do a bit of the Coke and Pepsi challenge, and let's see how Pepsi is marketing to an entirely different persona through another video example. Okay, so hopefully the sound came through for you, but even if it didn't, you can still get a sense of what's going on there. Now, that video, that whole production was made in 2014, but it still holds up 8 years later. And there's so many reasons why I love this example. First, it's obviously delivered some very strong results in terms of subscribers and engagements. It also takes advantage of what I call micro moments. They found a moment in the average everyday person's boring lives, waiting for a bus, right? Really boring, but they could inject their brand into that little micro moment. And that's a concept I'll come back to in just a minute. But they also took you behind the scenes here. Now, they maximized their marketing efforts, not only by just creating the billboard and saying, okay, we're done, put it up. No, they went a step further and they took you behind the scenes. They lifted the veil and they showed you how they made this happen and how people reacted to it, which was so much fun. So cool, such an interesting concept, right? But they let people into that experience. Now, today, in the midst of COVID, this strategy is incredibly important. We are letting the world into our homes on a daily basis, and consumers value that transparency. It builds trust. Now, also, this campaign had focused on a brand promise of unbelievable. They created these unbelievable scenarios in people's everyday lives. We couldn't actually see Coke doing something like this. It just doesn't fit their whole family feeling kind of persona. This is very Pepsi, very cool. But it also gave them a concept to anchor their campaigns around. They unleashed a series of examples of unbelievable moments for Pepsi fans around the world. Now, I'll also give you an example from the education industry, of course. So this is from Monash University down in Australia. They launched a campaign about 2 years ago under the slogan of, if you don't like it, change it. This was a very challenging type of a statement that challenged prospective students to change the world. It really fit the university's brand ethos and values, and it gave them a concept to anchor around with all these materials combined. So for example, they had these postcards, which have augmented reality built into them. No other institution was doing this at the time, and still I think not many are. But you simply hold your phone up, scan it, and boom, a video pops up and comes to life, showing you students, graduates, alumni, professors who are changing the world. So a nice way to bring some of those stories to life and to marry the offline experience with the online experience. They use posters, expos, displays, virtual days, open days at their campus. So a nice fun example there. But we see also the importance of having a consistent, powerful message anchored around a core theme, which you can then tease out across different channels and different marketing methods. So Monash had their Change It slogan. Notre Dame, another great university in America, their little mascot is called the Fighting Irish. So they created a whole series of content and a microsite to answer the question, what would you fight for? Lots of flexibility there from a marketing perspective. With Jackfruit Marketing, we came up with the slogan, Connections That Count, for one of our clients. And now all of the marketing that we do focuses around making connections. So a very important concept to keep in mind. Now, when we look at the student journey, it is an incredibly long and complicated student journey that we have. There's the whole process of just getting someone to be interested in your institution and to apply. But once they're enrolled, that's what, a 2 or 3 year journey with just your higher education institutions. And then, of course, the alumni journey itself, which is essentially for life. So actually, the education journey is probably one of the longest customer journeys out there. It might start from the age of 4 or 5, run straight through until you're in your early 20s. And because we need to have a lot of lifelong learning now and upskill throughout our life, that education journey is going to last a long time. So it's pretty much a lifetime product. Now that means that we have a lot of opportunities to find micro moments in this journey and engage with students along the way. We have this intense need for constant contact and touch points and to deliver satisfaction along that journey. So there is a need for a robust CRM system for universities, which many institutions do still struggle with. But it is incredibly important for us to create wow moments in the midst of all of these micro moments in this long and complex journey in order to stand out and to inject your brand story, to get prospects to engage with your brand. And essentially, it's about doing something interesting and cool, right? I mean, a wow moment exceeds expectations. If you're just meeting expectations, then it doesn't stand out, it's easily forgotten or dismissed, and your consumer is distracted and moves on to the next thing. But what these wow moments are really saying is, make me feel special. Do something exciting for me. Show me you care about me. Help me. Help me find my tribe. Help me find people like me. Help me fulfill my dreams and aspirations. Help me make my life easier. That's what consumers want. They want you to pay attention to them. Love me, hear me. These are basic human needs. And an international degree isn't just a 3 or a 4 year choice. This is a lifetime choice. And for most international students, it is one of the most important decisions that they will ever make in their life. And now today, with so many unknowns for students, so many changes in society, in education, in the way that we communicate with each other, it is even more important for us to create an emotional connection with our consumers, with our students. Show empathy for what they're going through. Create a two-way communication channel with them. Support your customer and help them out. The more you can help a prospect, the more your brand value will grow. So there's some great opportunities for content marketing here, to think like a publisher, not to just sell to them, but to help them, to give them information that will help them in their journey, and to find ways to connect with them in that journey. Marketing is essentially all about emotion. It's about creating an emotional response in customers that will drive sales. Now, people can buy almost anything today, but they choose to buy something not based on what it does, but based on how it makes them feel. So when you combine that emotion from your marketing department with that personal support and attention from your sales department, then you create this winning combination that others will find very difficult to compete against. So make it emotional, make it personal, and make it as easy as possible for your consumers. So there we are. I'd like to thank you so much for your time and attention today. These are my contact details. Please do connect with me on social media. Keep in touch via email. And I think we're going to go into the Q&A session now. But before we do, I'd like to give the floor over to Mr. Dimitris Lotidis, the CEO of SPP Media, who I believe has an important announcement to share with us about Cyprus's education landscape. So thank you so much for your time today.